Back in June of 2013, this card was released to much critical acclaim and anticipation. But now that we're 6 years out from release and games continue to become ever more demanding, older cards have been getting phased out in favor of newer and more powerful Pascal and Polaris based GPUs. But not all of us have $300 to spend on a new GPU, and the lower end cards such as the GTX 1050 and 1050 Ti are still slightly overpriced when looking at their performance. So then, what graphics card can you look at if you want decent 1080p performance without paying 1050 Ti prices? Well, let me introduce to you the GTX 760, the 6-year-old mid-range king, and for $55, 1080p 60fps is yours. Okay, so the first thing I have to say about this video is that we will be using a used card that we bought on the used market. We picked up the Zotac GTX 760 off eBay for $55 about a month ago, and it was actually featured in a previous video with our GTX 660. So if you aren't that big on buying used hardware, then I'd actually suggest to stick around because this card might actually change your mind. Age-wise, this card is still in pretty good shape, and although it took us a hot minute to open the card up and dust everything off, after we applied fresh thermal paste and checked all the thermal padding, putting the card back together was actually a relatively simple process. All in all, it took us about 30 minutes to fully strip and clean the card, and once we got the card running in our test system, thermals weren't an issue and the card was actually relatively quiet. Cooling wise, this card features a blower style cooler, which ejects the heat from the card out the back of your case, and although this is generally more efficient when you're cooling something like a GPU, this does limit overclocking, and when we raised the core by 100 MHz, thermals became a pretty noticeable issue, and we got some thermal throttling relatively quickly. We feel like this GPU should have used heat pipes or some other vapor chamber thing rather than just the metal fins, but as is, it's perfectly sufficient for stock clocks. Spec-wise, the GTX 760 actually isn't too far off the GTX 1060 3GB, with 1152 CUDA cores at 980 MHz that boosts up to 1032 MHz when thermals allow. Chip-wise, this card features the cut-down GK104 chip, which it shares with its bigger, more power-hungry brother, the GTX 760. With 96 texture mapping units and 32 rasterization operation pipelines, this variant of the GK104 chip is still equipped to run modern applications, with specs that, once again, are very comparable to the GTX 1060 3GB. Memory-wise, the configuration featured on this card is very similar to its higher-end brother, with 2 GB of GDDR5 on a 256-bit bus, equating to 192 GB per second of bandwidth, which is actually the same as the much more recent GTX 1060 6GB. But just because the memory bandwidth is almost identical doesn't mean that performance will be the same. Because this flavor of the GTX 760 only has 2 GB of video memory, textures and anti-aliasing will have to be lowered a bit to accommodate for the low capacity. There are other flavors of the 760 that feature 4 GB of memory, but at this point in time they're kinda hard to find, and if you do end up finding one, they're usually quite a bit more expensive. Power-wise, the GTX 760 features 2 6-pin connectors, and although finding a compatible PSU might be an issue, especially if you're on a budget, you can actually just buy a Molex to 6-pin adapter off Amazon or Newegg for about $2. So while this may be a bit limiting, the workaround is relatively inexpensive and takes about 5 minutes to install. Okay, so with all the specs out of the way, let's get into performance. The system we will be using today features an Intel Core i3-8350K overclocked to 4.4 GHz with 32 GB of Timetec DDR4. To store our system files, we're using the Timetec 480GB SSD, and to store our games, we're using a Barracuda 2TB HDD. So let's get into the results. To start, we ran our synthetic tests to gauge relative performance compared to other mid-range and budget cards. Starting off with the ashes of the Singularity GPU bench, the GTX 760 proves to be only about 5% behind the much more expensive and much more recent GTX 1050 Ti, but when looking at minimums, the 1050 Ti pulls ahead with a 55% margin. While the bench was running, the 1050 Ti also looked more visually consistent, and there seemed to be less stuttering. When moving on to our second synthetic test, the Universe Sandbox 2 Earth and Sphere of Moon simulation, the GTX 760 was only about 4% behind the 1050 Ti, and when looking at the results from the GTX 1060 6GB, it seems that we were slightly CPU limited. Either way, while running the benchmark, the frame rate normalized more quickly when using the 1050 Ti, but for a $55 card, the GTX 760 is holding itself remarkably well. Moving on from our synthetic test, the first game we tested was Battlefield 5, and at 1080p low settings, the GTX 760 returned an average of 51 FPS, which was only about 20% behind the GTX 1050 Ti and 61% behind the 1060 6GB. While 51 FPS might not be the best results, if you lower the resolution down to 900p, frame rates immediately jump up to the mid-60s, and there's even a little bit of headroom to raise a couple of settings. Even at 1080p though, there wasn't much stuttering, meaning that it felt pretty good to play, and for $55, it's hard to complain. Moving on, the second game in our test suite was Call of Duty Black Ops 4's Blackout mode, and at 1080p with 80% resolution scaling at low settings, the GTX 760 returned an average of 39 frames per second. Now, similarly to the GTX 660, the average FPS was actually more limited by the VRAM. With only 2 gigs of memory, this card has trouble streaming in data, and as a result, this game was full of stutters. Even so, lowering the resolution down to 900p and keeping low settings yields more playable numbers. Though it's still not 60 FPS, it's definitely better. The GTX 1050 Ti even had trouble at this resolution, but at 900p frame rates improved on all the cards tested. If you're looking to play Black Ops 4 on any card less powerful than the GTX 1060, then playing at 900p might be the best compromise between visuals and performance, as Black Ops 4 seems to be poorly optimized. Moving on from Black Ops 4, the next game we tested was 2016's Doom, and at 1080p medium settings using the OpenGL 4.5 renderer, the GTX 760 achieved an average of 63 FPS, which is only 16% behind the ever so popular GTX 1050 Ti. While playing Doom, the game looked alright, but whenever particle effects kicked off on screen, the frame rate dropped a noticeable amount. Dropping some settings would be able to solve this, but as is, I found that Doom is very playable on this card and I'd happily play it all day. The next game in our bench suite is For Honor, and at 1080p high settings, the GTX 760 returned an average of 58 frames per second. When comparing the average to other more recent cards, it may seem like it's falling behind, but for a $55 6-year-old card, to be getting nearly 60 FPS at high settings in any game in 2019 is incredibly impressive. While it is 22% behind the 1050 Ti, it's still offering very playable performance, and I'd happily play For Honor on the 760. The next title we tested was Fortnite, and at 1080p medium settings, the 6-year-old GTX 760 achieved an average of 112 frames per second. This is the one game where we actually might be hitting a CPU bottleneck, as frame rates kinda stagnate once you get to the 760. But even so, Fortnite is more than playable, and I'd gladly play Fortnite on the GTX 760. So the next game we benchmarked was PLAYUNKOWN'S Battlegrounds, and at 1080p medium settings, our GTX 760 returned an average of 50 frames a second, which is very playable. If you wanted more frames, then dropping some settings would be an option, but at medium settings, the game definitely doesn't look bad and it still feels pretty good to play. It also looks significantly better than any of the console versions, as there's not as much pop-up and things just don't look like Picasso paintings. For $55, I'd happily play PUBG at 50 frames per second, and dropping the resolution down to 900p would only make frame rates improve even further. So to wrap up our test, we benchmarked Titanfall 2 at 1080p in medium settings, with the GTX 760 returning an average of 60 frames per second. Now to improve the FPS, turning on the dynamic resolution scaler would do wonders, and after our tests, turning the feature on locked the frame rate to 60. While medium settings may not have the best fidelity, playing Titanfall 2 at 60 FPS is a real treat, especially when it's on such an inexpensive GPU. Okay, so with all the tests out of the way, how does the GTX 760 stack up to the 1050 Ti in terms of relative performance? Well, when looking at the average of all the tests we performed, the GTX 760 proved to be only about 12% behind the much more recent and much more expensive GTX 1050 Ti. When looking at the price to performance ratio, the GTX 760 takes the lead with 79 cents per frame. The modern budget king, the 1050 Ti, comes in with $1.90 per frame, which is still better than the GTX 1060, but also over twice the price of the 760. When looking at the value of this card, it offers about 88% the performance of the 1050 Ti while only being 36% of the price, and that's when calculating at the MSRP. Realistically, you'd probably be able to find a 1050 Ti for about $170, and if you account for the higher price, then the price per frame actually jumps up to nearly match the 1060. When considering that the 760 is now 6 years old, it's still impressive to see what it's capable of, and it still provides great AAA performance at an incredible price. If you're looking to purchase one of these 760s, however, I would recommend that you'd actually look for a 4GB variant, as that card will last quite a bit longer than the 2GB flavors. But if you are looking for a card that offers decent 1080p performance for less money than a GT 1030, then this card might be what you're looking for. Sure, it is older and less efficient, but if you're trying to get into PC gaming or building a budget system, then checking this card out isn't a bad option. For $55, you're getting GTX 1050 level performance, which isn't too far off what the 1050 Ti offers. While it's definitely not the latest from Nvidia, it's proven to still be capable and still worthy of checking out, and it's honestly a better buy than something like a GT 1030 or even an RX 550 or RX 560. I'm actually quite impressed as to what this card offers, and I'm even more surprised to see how it performs. Who knew that this card would still be great all these years later? It kind of makes me wonder though, what will we think of the 1060 in a few years, and will these older Kepler cards still be kicking and screaming? Well, as of now, the GTX 760 is still a great option, and it's still readily available on the used market. If you play your cards right and pick one of these up, you'll be playing some games and having a fantastic experience in no time at all. So thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and click the bell icon so you'll be notified about all our future uploads. And also, tell us, what was your first GPU? Me personally, I was rocking the R7 250 about 2 years ago, and then I upgraded to a 1050 Ti and most recently to a 1060. I can't wait to see what you guys have to say, and I hope you all have a fantastic day. But before I go, I would like to thank my patrons and would like to thank the people who have checked out my Discord channel. You guys are really the people that keep me going, and your guys' support really motivates me to make more of these videos. So if you do want to actually get closer to the community or talk to me personally, check out the Discord channel below, and if you do want to check it out, then why not drop by and say hi. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.